Hello and welcome to tonight's screencast. We're going to have a quick focus then on training and lifestyle disease, and we're going to have a particular look at how this might come up as a 20-mark question. So if I just get you to have a quick look on here then, what you've got here is the 2017 AS exam. So the question, a STEM, was this. Jogging is a very popular aerobic sport and activity as part of a healthy lifestyle. And the question here asks to explain the immediate effects of jogging on the vascular system and then evaluate the impact of regular training on lifestyle disease of the cardiovascular system. So you can see that this is kind of a question from an AS paper. It's only 10 marks. So what I've kind of had a look at is to think, right, how could this be used as a synoptic thread for kind of a 20-mark question at A level? So if I just show you onto here, I've got a potential 2019 A level variation. So I just put down to here. Part 1 could quite easily be critically evaluate the use of the aerobic energy system when jogging. We've looked at that, but this is the other way. Explain how neural mechanisms regulate the cardiac, vascular and respiratory systems when jogging, and explain the effect on an endurance performer. So I think this could be a really kind of a definite part 1 question, because I think the part 2 would be very similar. And the reason why I put this is because I think, you could have a question for year 2, or sorry, a 20-mark synoptic that asks you to evaluate the impact of regular training on lifestyle diseases of the cardiovascular and respiratory systems. Now, whether this is too much, I don't know, but I just think due to the fact you've got this kind of evaluate the impact, regular training on lifestyle diseases, cardiovascular, respiratory, obviously that lends itself to neural control of the cardiac system, vascular system and respiratory system. So I've just put this together. So this was an old question from an old AS 10-mark question, and I've just added vascular system in here. So ultimately what we're going to have a look at is how neural factors can regulate the 3 systems. So if we start here then, if I just show you a plan of attack, we're looking at receptors. We need to do a general description or provide some general descriptors linked to exercise. So what are our 3-4 receptors? What do they detect during exercise? And then we'll have a look at separately at each control center, starting with the cardiac control center and its impact on heart rate. Then we'll have a look at the vasomotor control center and its link to vascular shunt. Then we'll have a look at the respiratory control center and how it impacts mechanics of breathing via neural regulation, with a key focus here on inspiratory center, expiratory center, and I suppose remembering that the only time we need to talk about receptors again is this idea behind kind of when we talk about baroreceptors acting as a new receptor type. So it's acting now as a lung stretch receptor, and its sole responsibility, of course, is to stimulate the expiratory center to allow the exaggerated mechanics of breathing that take place during exercise. Now, final thing we need to do is make sure we've got performance effects. So that's part 1. Part 2, we'll have a look at the evaluation of kind of training on lifestyle diseases. That'll be our final part. So let's have a look then. So starting off, if we had a question on heart rate regulation via neural control, the cardiac system. So as soon as we've got this then, we have to remember that we've got 3 receptors, and I'm just going to explain this to you now. I think it'd be a good idea to talk about chemoreceptors, proprioceptors, baroreceptors in your first paragraph if you got this as a 20. Talk about what they detect, increase CO2 for chemoreceptors, decrease O2, increase muscle movement for proprioceptors, and baroreceptors there as an increase in blood pressure. Now, I think at that point, if once you did a paragraph on that, you might even add in thermoreceptors detect an increase in muscle and blood temperature. If you put those 4 in your first paragraph, you would not need to mention them again until you talked about baroreceptors stimulating the expiratory center during respiratory control. So paragraph 1, these. So then we go straight into our first focus, which is cardiac control center, which of course during exercise for a jogger, for example, is involved in increasing heart rate. So we're looking at this idea between that, the cardiac control center stimulating the sympathetic nervous system, which in turn stimulates the accelerator nerve, which will then stimulate the SA node, which will lead to an increase in heart rate. Now, because we are constantly considering now the fact we have to apply our subject knowledge to examples, the scenario in the question talked about a jogger. So we need to make sure that we talk about that heart rate, remember, doesn't stop there. Heart rate times stroke volume equals cardiac output. So it's really important that we have an idea that because we're talking about a jogger or a runner, that will increase in heart rate will directly link to an increased stroke volume and cardiac output. What does that mean for the jogger? Well, it means that as an endurance performer, they will have an increased oxygenated blood to the working muscles, which means the jogger or the runner will delay their point of oblet, allow them to run for a longer duration at a higher intensity. They're the type of things you just got to make sure you show application as well as your subject knowledge. Okay, so that's cardiac control center. Now, I'll put this on there. You do not need to redo this now. Okay, so the receptors would not need to be redone. I've just got them there just so you can see they're the same. The effects are the same, but this time we're talking about how neural factors will regulate the redistribution of blood flow via neural control. So in we go then. So now we're looking at the redistributing blood flow. In order to do to redistribute blood during exercise, the information sent to the vasomotor control center. Okay, and the vasomotor control center is responsible for focusing or kind of stimulating vascular shunt. It does this via vascular shunt being this, redistribution of blood flow to the working muscles during exercise. It does this via the sympathetic nervous system, and its specifics here, it will cause something called sympathetic reduction, where vasodilation of arterioles and precapillary sphincters supplying the working muscles will take place. This will mean that during exercise, we redistribute 80% of our blood to the working muscles. Now, on the flip side to that, we will then have vasoconstriction of the same vessels, arterioles and precapillary sphincters, that are supplying that should be the non-essential organs or the non-essential muscles. Please cross that out. So you've got that in on there. So that's that section. That talks about how it would work today. Just as a recap here, that should be non-essential organs or non-essential muscles. Okay, so if that's that one done, the final thing we have to have a look at is this idea of neural regulation of the mechanics of breathing, or the respiratory control center. So what we need to do is just have a quick understanding. Our receptors would not need to be rewritten if you put thermoreceptors in your first paragraph. What we need to have an understanding of now are that, the receptors you've talked about in paragraph 1, we would now be on paragraph 4, would now be talking about the fact that they go into the respiratory control center in the medulla oblongata. Now, this is the hardest one, okay? So it's important that we have a good idea of how we answer that. So as a result of the information from the aforementioned receptors, now what we need to have to do is have an understanding is that basically the respiratory control center is responsible for stimulating the inspiratory center. Now, the inspiratory center is responsible for stimulating inspiratory muscles to contract during exercise. Now, before it does that, it's really important that we remember that because this is during neural control, we have to talk about the fact that the inspiratory center is responsible for stimulating two nerves. The two nerves are the phrenic nerve and the intercostal nerve, and the phrenic nerve is directly responsible for stimulating the diaphragm, whereas the intercostal nerve is responsible for stimulating the external intercostal muscles. Those two muscles must be mentioned, and it must be very, very clear that they contract with more force. So we've got the diaphragm and external intercostal muscles contracting with more force. The additional extra muscles, such as the sternocleidomastoid and pectoralis minor, contract, and the result of this is the mechanics that underpin our breathing are exaggerated. So the ribs move up and out further. The thoracic cavity volume increases further. This means that the thoracic cavity pressure decreases more, and this will have a net effect of more air in, and more specifically, an increased depth of breathing. Now, that could be translated into tidal volume. If you feel more comfortable putting that, and you want some extra specific technical terminology. Now, if that's inspiration, that has to happen first. We inspire first. Now, as a result of this inspiration, this is where you would need to talk about one receptor in a slightly different way, because this whole process of exaggerated inspiratory mechanics of breathing means that our lungs stretch, and the receptor that notices this is the baroreceptors. So within respiratory control, the baroreceptors detect an increase in lung stretch. Now, this directly stimulates the expiratory center, and what that does is basically exaggerates the things that are happening to our expiratory mechanics of breathing. So never forget that when you talk about expiration, you must talk about the diaphragm and external intercostal muscles relaxing first. Before you even talk about the additional extra muscles, you must make sure you talk about the fact that the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles relax. This will then lead to extra muscles such as the rectus abdominis and the internal intercostal muscles contracting. This causes the ribs to move down and in further, which will decrease the thoracic cavity volume further, which will then lead to an increase in thoracic cavity pressure more now or further. This has a net effect of more air out as a result of an increased rate of breathing. Okay, so that will be the way we look at it. That is how it's slightly different for those two areas. So just make sure you feel confident on that. Of course, pause whenever you need to get notes down. So that is your first section. That is looking at this idea behind kind of neural regulation of 3 centers. Now, once we've done that, we move into the kind of training aspect of it. So before we do that, we've got to look at how training could lead to the prevention of cardiovascular, lifestyle diseases, and respiratory. But we're going to start with cardiovascular. Now, I think first thing you could do, whichever way here, you could talk about training first, or you could give the cardiovascular lifestyle diseases, as I'm going to do, and then talk about how training can combat them. So you've got 4 diseases: atherosclerosis, A, accumulation of fatty deposits or low-density lipoproteins around the coronary artery wall, which will lead to a narrowing of the lumen of the arteries. Okay, coronary artery specifically. So what, where, effect. Now, next one. We have coronary heart disease. Now, this is a kind of a byproduct of atherosclerosis. If that's the cause, this is the effect. And it basically is a kind of refers to the narrowing of the coronary artery, which will lead to an increased blood pressure and potentially a blood clot. Now, if I go down from there, heart attack, complete blockage of the coronary artery, damage in the heart muscle can lead to potential death. And then the final thing we look at, which is a slight difference with regard to where they take place, because everything else has been at coronary artery. The stroke is when you have a blockage of the cerebral artery, which is supplying the brain, which means no oxygen to the brain, and it can lead to bleeding of the brain. So they are your cardiovascular lifestyle diseases. You have to make sure that you have described these. Now, once we've done that, we can start having a look at if these diseases you get from inactivity, from a poor lifestyle, what happens when you exercise that can directly combat these cardiovascular lifestyle diseases. So we start here then. First thing you might do, training. The types of training you could do would be, fit principle, very quickly, 3 times a week, anywhere between 50 and 80% of your max heart rate, a time period of 20 to 40 minutes, and you'd be looking at things such as continuous training and jogging. Now, if you do this, you will have direct adaptations. Some of these are the same as aerobic adaptations, but there are some more specific ones. So we have a decrease in low density lipoproteins, which are the dangerous cholesterol, the fatty deposits, the plaque surrounding the coronary artery. And in opposition to that, we have an increase in high-density lipoproteins, which are these kind of act as scavengers and chip away at the low-density lipoproteins, reducing the idea of atherosclerosis and allowing a more free-flowing blood flow. Cardiac hypertrophy, I put onto there, increases stroke volume, cardiac output, which will lead to the increased elasticity of the arteries, allowing opening and closing, allowing the blood to flow. I'll let you read these. Obviously, number 6 is really important there. So you talk about decreased blood viscosity, which prevents blood clots. And then also, as a result of training, you will increase the resting blood pressure. Now, if that is training, you've got to be careful because it does ask you about the command word for training. And it says, evaluate the impact of training. So we've got to just make sure that we have an understanding that regular training can have a negative effect on someone that has a very high blood pressure, for example, hypertension, or they're doing really intense exercise such as HIIT with no previous experience. If they've got pre-existing medical conditions, you should exercise with caution, or you should consult with a doctor or physician to make sure that they are in a position to train. So it's really important that you show an understanding of the command word there and can apply it. Final thing now, respiratory lifestyle disease, our final little section. These are the 2 of those. So just make sure you've got them into the kind of into your answer, and then we need to make sure that we've just moved on to the idea of training linked to lifestyle disease and how it prevents respiratory lifestyle disease. So we've talked about training already, so we don't need to do it again. If you take part in it, these are the adaptations to the respiratory system that could aid or prevent, respiratory disease. So this is what we're looking at here, capillarization around the alveoli. This allows more efficient gaseous exchange of oxygen into the respiratory system. We have an increase in lung volumes, so tidal volume, minute ventilation, allowing a more kind of settled breathing pattern. We'd also have increased efficiency of the gas mechanics of breathing, so our intercostal and diaphragm hypertrophy. And then on top of this, we would have a reduced breathing rate and frequency, so we don't have to have as many breaths per minute in order to get the same oxygen in. Therefore, that is more healthy for our respiratory system. final thing is we have an increased surface area of the alveoli, and this can be really beneficial in preventing chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder. Okay, so they will be the kind of things you're looking at. Hopefully you feel like that will give you something to have a decent go at it, and that will be a potential thread for lifestyle diseases linked to neural regulation of the cardiac, respiratory and vascular system.